welcome back to our study of evolution. Last week we learned what evolution was. We defined it roughly as the change in a population's heritable characteristics over generations or over time. This week, through this presentation, we're going to learn a little bit about what drives evolution, or what is the process that causes evolution to occur. And that process, as we know it, is called natural selection. We're going to learn a little bit about the people involved in helping come up with this theory or this process of natural selection. It's not just one person like many people think. There were others involved. And we're going to learn the steps. Not that there are necessarily an order to them, but there's certain things that occur that drive at natural selection and evolution. So the first step, or first thing that Charles Darwin, who is credited with developing this theory of natural selection, the first thing he noticed was that in any population there's overproduction. And this simply means that more offspring are born than can survive. And I don't think it's an earth-shattering idea. It's not one that really blows your mind. Anybody who's ever watched Finding Nemo knows that this is true. So we're going to watch a little clip here of Finding Nemo. The sound is a little tough, so please turn your volume up so you can hear it.
Right by their bedroom. We're gonna make the kids. Right. You still have to name them. Want to name all of them? Yeah. All right. We'll name this half Marlin Jr. and this half Coral Jr. Okay, we're done.
I like Nemo.
We'll name one Nemo, but I'd like most of them to be Marlin Jr.
Just think in a couple of days we're going to be parents.
They don't like me.
There's over 400 eggs. Odds are one of them is bound to like you.
So there you hear Coral say there are over 400 eggs. And how many of those eggs survived? If you've seen the movie, you know the answer. The answer is 1. Nemo. That was it. Out of 400, 1 egg survived. Quick math break. What percent of the eggs survived? I'll give you a second to figure that out. Did you get it? That's right. 0.25%, less than 1% of all of the eggs that were laid survived in that situation. So that's a great example of overproduction. More offspring are born than can survive. Now, as I mentioned, Charles Darwin, who is credited with coming up with this idea of natural selection, although he wasn't alone, there were people he worked with and people who he drew ideas from. He recognized this as well, but he didn't come up to that idea of overproduction on his own. He relied on reading a book by a guy named Malthus. And Malthus was sort of a philosopher who talked about population dynamics and commerce and politics. And Darwin read a book by him and took some of his ideas and applied them to nature. And here's a clip of Darwin talking to his brother. Darwin will be on the right, his brother will be on the left, and sort of having that aha moment of, hey, I can apply these ideas to nature and help me formulate my theory.
Whenever I can't sleep, I reach for Malthus.
That's his
Or as
brother.
I prefer to think of him, the Reverend T.R.
And
Morpheus.
the guy sitting on the right is Darwin.
Still warm. 2 brandies.
Yes, sir.
The natural tendency of mankind is to reproduce. Humans can double their numbers every 25 years.
But they don't. A struggle for resources slows growth, and death and disease, war and famine check the population. I know the argument.
Yes, but don't you see exactly the same struggle takes place throughout nature? I don't know why I didn't make the connection before. Why are we not overrun with insects and frogs? Or given the rate at which they reproduce, the number of eggs produced by each and every female?
That's a great question. Why aren't we overrun by insects and frogs? They produce thousands of eggs at a time. How come we're not overrun by them? Well, the truth is that not all of them survive, and Darwin recognized this. Why don't they survive? Well, some are going to be killed by predators, some will die of starvation, some might be killed in a natural disaster like a flood or a hurricane. Others might not have enough space to live, some might not find a mate. So there's all these different reasons why some organisms aren't going to survive and others are. The question is, which ones survive? Why do one survive over another? And that's what you're going to learn about next. So enjoy the rest of the presentation and enjoy natural selection.
The second step of natural selection is variation. So evolution is a change in a population over generations. So if every single organism in one population is exactly the same, we're not going to see any change. We need variation, some difference in phenotype within a population. In this example, the variation is with hair color. If we look at this picture of rabbits, we can see that there's variation in fur color and in size. Okay, so in order to get a new phenotype to spread through a population, you need there to be a variety of phenotypes. But what causes this variation to begin with? There are three really notable biologists who asked this question: Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, Charles Darwin, and Alfred Russel Wallace. Lamarck put forward a theory called use and disuse. He thought that organisms developed new phenotypes, new traits, based on their environments. For example, if a giraffe only eats from short trees, then his neck is going to stay the same length and he will pass on a short length neck to his offspring. On the other hand, if a giraffe is always eating leaves from tall trees, then eventually he will acquire the trait of a long neck and then pass that on to his offspring. The idea that we can acquire new traits during our lifetime and then pass them on to our offspring is sometimes called Lamarckism or Lamarckianism, after Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. When Darwin and Wallace later came up with the theory of natural selection, they knew variation was important, but they weren't sure what caused it, and they were pretty open to Lamarck's idea of use and disuse. But we know today, they are wrong. What actually causes variation is not whether or not you practice a skill while you're alive. It all comes down to mutations in your DNA. We know that DNA is a code for our traits. And if there is a change in our DNA, a mutation, then that could lead to a change in our traits. It's not because we are intentionally trying to mutate longer necks. There just happens to be a random mutation that might lead to a longer neck, might even lead to a shorter neck. But let's not be too hard on these biologists. After all, they were trying to figure out what causes variation before we even knew what DNA does for us. So if we look at a population of rabbits and we see that there are variations in fur color or in size, it's not that these rabbits are trying to change their traits, it's that they just happen to be born with a random mutation that made their fur color different or their size different. Let's recap the second step of natural selection, variation. What is evolution? It's when a change spreads through a population over many generations. What is variation? Differences in traits within a population. And what causes variation? Random mutations in DNA.
Ms. Shield here to explain the third step of natural selection, which is the struggle to survive. You may have heard of this step before as survival of the fittest. But what does that mean exactly? Well, you need to understand that in nature, there are limited resources. There is only so much food, water, shelter, and even mates to go around. So if there aren't enough of these resources for every single organism, they're going to compete for them. Let me give you an example you might be able to relate to. Let's say you're back at school and you have third lunch. You're sitting in class and you just can't wait to get to lunch. All you can think about is pizza. And you really want some pizza. So finally you get to go to lunch. You get in line and the pizza is all gone. Limited resources. There was only so many pieces of pizza and all the people before you got the pizza and now it's out. So you don't get any food. Now in nature, that's a similar situation, that there are only so many resources to go around. In nature though, it's the organisms that are best adapted that are going to get those resources. For the rabbits, for example, the rabbits that run faster can get away from predators more easily and they'll survive. The rabbits that are better at getting their food, maybe they blend in better so they won't get eaten. So those organisms with those better traits are the ones that are going to continue on to the next generation. So this is what survival of the fittest means, and I hope you've learned a little bit more about step 3 of natural selection.
Hi, Miss Dugas here to talk to you about the last element for natural selection. In order for natural selection to occur, there must be successful reproduction. Only individuals who are well adapted to their environment, as in they have better traits that allow them to both survive in that environment and reproduce, are going to be able to reproduce. And only those individuals that reproduce will be able to pass on those genes. Those genes meaning those better traits that allow them to survive in that environment. So these are the individuals that will be able to reproduce and pass on the genes. And the helpful variation, as in all those different traits, become more common in the population, which over time allows different species to adapt and change. In our example that we've been talking about the whole time, we have our rabbit example here. This is a picture of a rabbit with little rabbit babies. It's very cute. That parent rabbit, or that mother, I assume, had the necessary genes in order to survive in their environment and were then able to reproduce and pass along those genes. The gene could be hopping a little bit faster, so they could avoid predators. That would allow them to survive in that environment. And their offspring would most likely also have that gene for hopping a little bit faster in order to escape predators and grow up and reproduce on their own. So that is the last element of natural selection. Successful reproduction must occur in order for natural selection to also occur.